Edinburgh, 1349. The plague has arrived, and the city will never be the same. What most people don't know is that when the Black Death reached Scotland's capital, the citizens didn't panic and flee into the countryside. They locked themselves inside their homes and prayed that the smell of death passing by their windows would somehow skip their door. If you want to discover more hidden truths about history's darkest moments and the people who lived through them, subscribe now, because what comes next will change how you see survival forever. The first cases appeared in late spring, carried north on merchant ships from English ports already drowning in corpses. Edinburgh in 1349 was a city of perhaps 4,000 souls, most of them crammed into the narrow closes and winds that tumbled down the steep ridge from the Castle Rock to the marshlands below. The old town was a vertical city, houses stacked 4 and 5 stories high, each floor jutting out further than the one beneath, until neighbours across the lane could nearly touch hands from their windows. In normal times, this closeness bred community. Now it bred contagion. Margaret Sinclair was a Brewster, one of dozens of women who made their living selling ale from their homes along the Cowgate. Her hands were perpetually stained dark from the malt, her apron smelling of yeast and grain. She'd been brewing since before dawn on the morning her neighbour, Thomas the Saddler, failed to open his shutters. By midday, the smell coming from his workshop wasn't leather. By evening, his wife was screaming for a priest who would not come. Margaret stood in her doorway, ladle in hand, watching the light fade from Thomas's windows, and made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable a month earlier. She poured her day's batch into the street and barred her door from the inside. The plague didn't announce itself with trumpets or thunder. It crept through Edinburgh's closes like fog rolling in from the Firth of Forth, silent and inevitable. A man would wake feeling tired, attributing it to poor sleep or too much ale. By noon, the fever would have him. By nightfall, the swellings would emerge in the neck, under the arms, in the groin hard as stones and black as sin. Some victims lasted 3 days. Others were dead before the church bells rang Compline. The speed of it was what terrified people most. You could break bread with someone at breakfast and be digging their grave before supper. But here's what the history books rarely tell you about plague cities: life didn't stop. It couldn't. People still needed water from the wells. Bakers still needed to bake, or the living would starve alongside the dead. The city's governance, such as it was, fell to the bailies and burgesses, men elected to manage trade and keep order. In 1349, keeping order meant enforcing quarantine, organizing mass graves, and trying desperately to understand why God had unleashed this punishment. They banned public gatherings. They outlawed the ringing of death bells, not out of disrespect, but because the constant tolling was driving the survivors mad. The bells had been ringing almost continuously for weeks. John Balliol, a fishmonger who worked the markets near the Norloch, watched his trade collapse in a matter of days. Fish was suspicious. Now, did it carry the miasma? Could the sickness hide in the silvery scales of herring? People who'd once crowded his stall at dawn now hurried past, pressing herbs to their noses, convinced that the right combination of rosemary and rue might shield them from corruption. John adapted. He began selling his catch door to door, calling up to windows, leaving fish wrapped in cloth on doorsteps in exchange for coins lowered in baskets. He never touched the money directly. He'd pour it into a bowl of vinegar first, let it sit, then scoop it out with a wooden spoon. Superstition? Perhaps. But John survived when 3/4 of the fishmongers didn't. The streets themselves became a geography of avoidance. Everyone knew which closes had been hardest hit. Blackfriars Wynd was a death trap. The Dominican friars who'd given the lane its name were among the first to fall, their devotion to the sick sealing their fate. Flesh Market Close, where the butchers worked, reeked so badly that even the plague-hardened avoided it. But the Royal Mile, the main artery connecting the castle to Holyrood Abbey, remained grimly functional. Here, the few remaining priests moved like ghosts in their robes, administering last rites through closed doors, their voices hoarse from prayers that seemed to go unanswered. Children were the hardest to protect, and the hardest to watch suffer. A mother named Isabel Henderson had 4 children at the start of summer. By August, she had one, a daughter named Agnes, barely 6 years old, with hair the color of autumn barley. Isabel had kept Agnes inside for 2 months, feeding her on dried oats. and whatever vegetables hadn't rotted in the garden patch behind their tenement. The girl had asked about her brothers only once, and Isabel had told her they'd gone to stay with family in the borders. It was a lie that hurt worse than the truth, but Isabel couldn't bear to see understanding in those young eyes. Agnes spent her days singing to herself, old ballads Isabel's mother had taught her, her voice echoing through the empty rooms like a ghost of normalcy. Something you need to understand about medieval Edinburgh: the city had no sewage system beyond throwing waste into the streets and hoping rain would wash it toward the North Loch. Every evening at 10 o'clock, residents would open their windows and shout "Gardy Lou" as a warning before hurling the contents of their chamber pots into the darkness below. In plague time, this daily ritual took on new horror. The streets became rivers of filth mixed with the bodily fluids of the dying. The smell was beyond description, a combination of human waste, rotting flesh, smoke from constant fires meant to purify the air, and the sickly sweet stench of the flowers people scattered everywhere in a futile attempt to mask it all. Walking through Edinburgh in the summer of 1349 meant wading through a nightmare. The wealthy, predictably, had options the poor did not. Edinburgh's burgesses, the merchant class who controlled the city's trade, could afford to flee to rural estates or lock themselves in the better-built stone houses with months of provisions. But wealth was no guarantee. The plague killed indiscriminately, taking the provost's son and the beggar with equal enthusiasm. There's a record, preserved in the city's fragmentary accounts, of a wealthy wool merchant named William Muir, who'd stockpiled enough food to last a year, barricaded his family inside their house on the high street, and allowed no one in or out. They found them all dead in October, every one of them though, whether from plague or something else, no one could say. The door was still barred from the inside. Medical understanding in 1349 was a mixture of ancient Greek theory, Christian theology, and desperate improvisation. The few physicians who remained in Edinburgh believed the plague was caused by corrupt air or miasma, released either by earthquakes, comets, or the alignment of planets. Treatment focused on restoring the body's balance of humours through bloodletting, purging, and the application of poultices to the buboes. These poultices were horrific concoctions, mixtures of lily root, human excrement, butter, and sometimes the flesh of recently killed pigeons, applied burning hot to the swellings. The theory was that extreme heat would draw out the poison. In practice, it mostly added agony to suffering, but folk remedies proliferated where medicine failed. Old women who knew herb lore became suddenly valuable, their knowledge of plants passed down through generations, now the city's best hope. They prescribed theriaca, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients including viper flesh, opium, and rose oil, which did nothing to cure plague but might have eased the pain. They burned juniper and frankincense, believing the smoke would cleanse the air. They made protective amulets from arsenic, dried toads, and emeralds, selling them for whatever people could pay. When you're watching your family die, you'll try anything. The church's response was perhaps the most complex aspect of Edinburgh's plague experience. This was an intensely religious society, where daily life revolved around the rhythms of prayer and the calendar of saints' days. When the plague struck, people's first instinct was to seek divine intervention. They organized processions through the streets, carrying relics and singing psalms, believing collective piety might turn away God's wrath. The church authorities, to their credit, quickly banned these gatherings when they realized they were spreading the disease faster than anything else. But this created a spiritual crisis. If communal prayer was forbidden, if the sick couldn't receive last rites because priests were dead or terrified, what hope did anyone have for salvation? Some priests stayed. Father Andrew at St. Giles's Church heard confessions through a wooden screen, never seeing the faces of those whose sins he absolved, many of whom were dead before dawn. He survived the plague, one of the few clergy who did, and his later writings describe a faith tested to its absolute limit. He buried so many dead in the churchyard that they ran out of space and had to start digging plague pits beyond the city walls. He wrote of celebrating Mass alone in an empty church, while outside the city burned corpses in great pyres that lit the night sky orange. He questioned whether God had abandoned Scotland, whether Edinburgh's sins had been so great as to warrant this apocalypse. But he stayed, and he prayed, because what else could he do? Daily work, when it could be done, took on surreal qualities. The city's records show that trade didn't stop entirely, it just became strange. Merchants did business through intermediaries, standing at opposite ends of streets, shouting negotiations. Money changed hands through elaborate systems designed to avoid contact. Contracts were signed with both parties' seals, but never in the same room. The Burgh Court, which normally met weekly to settle disputes over property and trade, convened irregularly with whoever showed up. There's a record from July of a court session with only 2 bailies present instead of the usual 10, adjudicating a dispute about unpaid rent on a property where both the tenant and landlord were dead. They ruled that the rent was void. Who would collect it? Who would enforce the judgment? The very structures of society were dissolving. Edinburgh's trades suffered unevenly. Weavers could work alone, so some survived. Masons and builders, who worked in groups, were devastated. The city's defensive walls, already in disrepair, fell into worse condition as the men who knew how to maintain them died. The Brewsters and Bakers, despite the danger, kept working because they had no choice stop making ale and bread, and you guarantee starvation atop plague. The prostitutes who worked the lanes near the castle, women already marginalized and vulnerable, simply vanished from the records. Whether they died, fled, or were driven out by a population looking for scapegoats, we'll never know. Scapegoating did happen, though Scotland was spared the worst of the anti-Jewish violence that swept through Europe. Edinburgh in 1349 had virtually no Jewish population. They'd been expelled from Scotland decades earlier. But suspicions still needed an outlet. Strangers were attacked, particularly those speaking with English accents, as if the plague was a military invasion rather than an invisible killer. Beggars were driven from the gates. Anyone with unusual habits or foreign ways might find themselves accused of poisoning wells, despite no evidence and no logic. Fear makes people cruel, and Edinburgh's citizens were paralyzed with fear. The seasons changed, but the dying didn't stop. Summer turned to autumn, and with the cooler weather came a brief, false hope that the plague might be receding. Cases did slow slightly. Modern epidemiologists believe the pneumonic form of plague, which spreads person to person through breath, became less transmissible in colder months. But the bubonic form, carried by fleas on rats, continued its work. Edinburgh's tenements were full of rats, thriving in the filth and darkness, and everyone could host thousands of fleas. People didn't understand this mechanism. They knew rats were unclean, but so was everything else. They had no idea they were living in intimate proximity with the actual engines of their destruction. By winter, the city had changed fundamentally. Streets that once echoed with the shouts of vendors and the hammering of craftsmen were quiet, except for the wind. Entire buildings stood empty, their inhabitants gone without anyone left to claim the property. Squatters moved into abandoned houses, but carefully there was always the fear that whatever had killed the previous occupants might linger in the walls. The city's population, which had been around 4,000, was perhaps half that now, maybe less. The records are unclear, partly because the people who kept the records were dead. Food supplies became a critical concern. Edinburgh wasn't self-sufficient even in good times. The city depended on the surrounding countryside, the Lothians, for grain, vegetables, and livestock. But the plague had ravaged the rural areas too, and even where it hadn't, peasants were reluctant to bring their goods to a city known to be infected. There were incidents of farmers leaving produce at agreed-upon spots outside the city gates, then retreating while Edinburgh's buyers came forward to collect it and leave payment behind. Trust had broken down so completely that basic commerce required these elaborate dances of avoidance. Yet somehow, absurdly, life's smaller rituals continued. Women still gossiped at wells, though they stood farther apart and spoke of nothing but who had died. Children who'd been kept inside for months were eventually let out to play, because what was the alternative? Watch them go mad from confinement. Young couples still fell in love, though courtship now meant standing at opposite sides of a close, speaking through masks of herb-soaked cloth. There's even a record of a wedding at St. Giles's in November. The bride and groom standing 6 feet apart, the priest reading the vows as quickly as possible before fleeing back to whatever hole he'd been hiding in. The human need for connection, for normalcy, for hope, persisted even as the world crumbled. Margaret Sinclair, The Brewster we met earlier survived the plague year. She emerged from her self-imposed quarantine in early 1350 to find her street transformed. Of the 20 families who'd lived on her close, 6 remained. Thomas the saddler's shop was a burned-out shell. Someone had tried to purify it with fire and lost control. The well they'd all shared was choked with debris and possibly corpses. No one wanted to look too closely. Margaret walked to the market and found it half empty. The stalls operated by people she didn't recognize, newcomers already moving in to fill the void. She sold her first batch of ale in 4 months to a stonemason who'd arrived from Fife, drawn by the promise of work rebuilding what the plague had broken. They didn't speak of the dead. There were too many, and what was there to say? The long-term consequences for Edinburgh were profound. The city's population didn't fully recover for over a century. Labour shortages gave surviving workers unprecedented bargaining power. A mason or brewer could name their price, because there simply weren't enough of them left. This led to the erosion of traditional feudal relationships and the rise of a more mercantile economy. Property changed hands rapidly, as inheritance laws struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of death. Orphans were everywhere, absorbed into new families or apprenticed young to trades desperate for workers. The city's power structure shifted as established families were wiped out, and new ones rose from the chaos. Psychologically, the plague left scars that would shape Scottish culture for generations. A certain dourness, a fatalism about life's cruelty, became embedded in Edinburgh's character. The city's later embrace of Protestantism, with its emphasis on predestination and divine judgment, didn't come from nowhere. It grew from the soil of 1349. From the desperate need to make sense of senseless suffering. If the plague was God's will, then perhaps rigorous moral discipline could prevent such punishment from returning. The connection isn't direct, but it's there, a dark thread running through the city's religious history. There's no monument to the Black Death in Edinburgh's Old Town, no plaque marking where the plague pits were dug beyond the city walls. The medieval city built itself atop its own ruins, layer upon layer, until the suffering of 1349 was buried under centuries of new construction. But if you walk the Royal Mile today, squinting past the tourist shops and street performers, you can still trace the contours of that older, darker city. The narrow closes are still there, those claustrophobic passages where the plague spread from window to window. The old wells are still marked, dry now, but once the gathering points where news of death was exchanged in whispers. St. Giles's Cathedral still stands, though rebuilt many times, on the spot where Father Andrew said Mass to an empty church. What's remarkable isn't that Edinburgh survived. Cities are remarkably resilient, more idea than place, and ideas are hard to kill. What's remarkable is that the people who lived through it maintained their humanity in the face of apocalypse. Margaret brewing ale again, John the fishmonger developing his elaborate coin-washing ritual, Isabel Henderson lying to her daughter about her dead brothers because the truth was too heavy for a child to carry. These weren't heroes in any traditional sense. They were ordinary people doing whatever was necessary to make it through one more day, then another, until enough days had passed that they could almost believe life might return to normal. The Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Scotland's population, and Edinburgh's losses were likely toward the higher end of that range. Yet what killed most people wasn't the disease itself, but the collapse of the systems that sustained life. Food distribution, water supplies, basic sanitation, medical care, even the human contact that makes existence bearable. The plague exposed how fragile civilization is, how quickly the structures we take for granted can dissolve when pushed past their limits. Medieval Edinburgh had no margin for error, no resilience built into its systems, and when crisis came, those systems shattered. But here's the truth that history sometimes obscures in its focus on death, counts, and timeline of events. The people of 1349 Edinburgh weren't that different from us. They loved their children and feared for their futures. They tried to make sense of chaos, using whatever mental frameworks they had available, whether that was the four humours, or planetary alignment, or divine judgment. They made mistakes born of ignorance and fear, but they also showed remarkable courage and adaptability. They were neither noble savages nor helpless victims, but people, complicated and contradictory, doing their best in impossible circumstances. When we talk about the Black Death, We often speak in abstractions, mortality rates, economic impacts, the end of feudalism, and we lose sight of what it meant to live through a single day in that city in that year. To wake up wondering if today would be the day you felt the first fever. To hear your neighbor screaming and know there was nothing you could do. To watch bodies piled in the street like cordwood because there weren't enough living to bury the dead. To make impossible choices about who to save and who to abandon, knowing you'd live with those choices for whatever time remained. This was reality for Edinburgh in 1349, not for weeks or months, but for the better part of a year, an eternity of suffering compressed into 4 seasons. The plague eventually loosened its grip, not because of anything Edinburgh did, but because epidemics burn themselves out when they run out of susceptible hosts. By early 1350, new cases had slowed to a trickle. The survivors emerged cautiously from their self-imposed isolation, blinking in the light like people waking from a nightmare, half expecting to find it hadn't been real. But the empty houses and mass graves confirmed it all. The city they'd known was gone, replaced by something harder, more haunted, marked by loss, in ways both visible and invisible. Edinburgh would rebuild, would even thrive in centuries to come, but it would never be quite the same. The plague had rewritten the city's story, adding a chapter of darkness that would forever shape its character. So the next time you encounter one of those simple historical facts, the Black Death reached Scotland in 1349, remember that behind that single sentence are thousands of individual stories of terror and resilience, of death and adaptation, of a city and its people facing the unimaginable, and somehow, against all odds, surviving to tell the tale.